In 1844, in a dimly lit Parisian cafe thick with tobacco smoke and revolutionary fervour, a 26-year-old German exile named Karl Marx met Friedrich Engels for the second time. What emerged from their 10-day conversation would become a philosophical framework that reshaped how millions understood history, economics, and the very nature of reality itself. This is the story of dialectical materialism, the philosophical engine at the heart of Marxist thought. We will trace how Marx and Engels fused Hegelian dialectics with a radically materialist view of history, creating a system that claimed to explain not just how societies change, but why they must change. From its origins in German idealism, through its transformation into a revolutionary doctrine that would influence a third of the world, we will explore how this framework understood contradiction, not as logical error, but as the fundamental motor of historical transformation. The meeting in Paris was not their first encounter. Marx and Engels had met briefly 2 years earlier in Cologne, an awkward exchange that left both men unimpressed. But by 1844, everything had changed. Marx had been expelled from Germany for his radical journalism, forced into exile where he found himself among French socialists and German émigré intellectuals. Engels had just completed a searing investigation of industrial England, documenting conditions in Manchester's factories that would make comfortable readers recoil. When they met again at the Café de la Régence, the same establishment where Diderot and Rousseau had argued philosophy a century before, they discovered that they had independently arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about the relationship between economic conditions and human consciousness. They talked for 10 days straight. Engels would later describe it as the moment when their theoretical collaboration truly began, though the full scope of what they were creating would not become clear for years. What they were forging was nothing less than an inversion of Western philosophy's dominant framework. For 2,000 years, philosophers had largely assumed that ideas shaped the world, that great thoughts, religious revelations, or moral principles determined how societies organized themselves. Plato's forms, Christian theology, Enlightenment reason, all placed consciousness, spirit, or intellect as the primary mover of human affairs. Even Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, whose dialectical method Marx admired profoundly, had conceived of history as the unfolding of Geist, an abstract spirit working through time towards self-realization. Marx and Engels proposed to stand this entire tradition on its head. Material conditions, who owns the land, who controls the factories, how people feed and clothe themselves, these determine consciousness, not the reverse. Religion, law, philosophy, art, political systems, all of these emerge from and reflect underlying economic relations. Change those relations and everything else follows. The superstructure of ideas rests on the base of material production. This was not merely a theoretical claim. It was a call to action grounded in observation of actual factories, actual slums, actual human beings working 16-hour days in conditions that treated them as expendable components in industrial machinery. But recognizing that material conditions shape consciousness was only the beginning. The deeper insight came from wedding this materialism to Hegel's dialectical method. Hegel had understood that history moves through contradiction, that every condition contains within itself the seeds of its own transformation, that thesis generates antithesis, producing synthesis in an endless spiral of development. Marx saw this pattern not in the realm of abstract spirit, but in concrete social relations. Capitalism itself embodied a profound contradiction. It socialized production, bringing thousands of workers together in coordinated labor, yet it privatized appropriation, concentrating wealth in the hands of those who owned, but did not work the means of production. This was not a moral failing to be reformed through better policies or enlightened leadership. It was a structural contradiction that would intensify until the system transformed into something fundamentally different. What made this framework so potent and so dangerous to established orders was its claim to inevitability. This was not wishful thinking or utopian fantasy. It was, Marx insisted, scientific analysis of historical laws as real as the laws of physics. Just as capitalism had emerged necessarily from feudalism when the contradictions of that earlier system became unbearable, so too would capitalism give birth to socialism through its own internal dynamics. The proletariat, the industrial working class, would become the gravedigger of the system that created it. Revolution was not a matter of if, but when. You might recognize echoes of these ideas even if you have never read Marx. They saturate modern discourse about economic inequality, corporate power, false consciousness, and systemic oppression. Terms like base and superstructure, ideology, class struggle, alienation, these entered common vocabulary even among those who reject Marxist conclusions. The framework proved extraordinarily influential not because everyone agreed with it, but because it asked questions and identified patterns that could not be ignored. Why do the ideas of each era so consistently serve the interests of those who hold economic power? How do material conditions constrain the realm of political possibility? When does reform merely stabilize an unjust system? And when does qualitative transformation become necessary? Yet dialectical materialism's very power created profound problems. If material conditions determine consciousness, how can anyone achieve revolutionary awareness before conditions change? If history unfolds according to laws, what room remains for human choice and moral responsibility? If the economic base determines the ideological superstructure, does art have no autonomy? Does science merely serve class interests? Does philosophy reduce to rationalization? Marx himself was more nuanced than many of his followers, acknowledging that the relationship between base and superstructure involved reciprocal influence, that historical development was not mechanical predestination, but the framework's deterministic tendencies could not be entirely escaped, and they would haunt Marxist thought through the 20th century. There is a deeper irony here. Dialectical materialism was born from studying how ideas emerge from material conditions and serve material interests, yet it became, itself, one of the most consequential ideas of the modern era, reshaping governments, inspiring revolutions, dividing the world into ideological camps. An idea claiming that ideas are secondary to matter proved that ideas matter immensely. This paradox sits at the heart of the framework and has never been fully resolved. Perhaps it cannot be resolved. Perhaps the relationship between consciousness and material reality resists reduction to any single formula, contains contradictions that generate perpetual motion between competing perspectives. What we will explore in the hours ahead is not merely an abstract philosophical system, but a living intellectual tradition that shaped and was shaped by the tumultuous history of the past 2 centuries. We will trace how a young German radical studying Hegel in 1830s Berlin came to reject his master's idealism. We will follow Marx and Engels as they forged their partnership amid the revolutionary upheavals of 1848. We will examine the core claims of dialectical materialism, its theory of base and superstructure, its understanding of contradiction as motor of change, its analysis of ideology and false consciousness. We will watch as this framework confronted historical realities that refused to conform to its predictions, forcing revisions and generating fierce debates. We will see how it ossified into Soviet orthodoxy, while simultaneously inspiring Western critical theory, and we will ask what remains valuable in this tradition, what insights it genuinely illuminated, and where its determinism led it astray. The story begins not in Paris, but earlier, in the lecture halls and beer gardens of 1830s Berlin, where a young man immersed himself in the most sophisticated philosophical tradition of his age, never suspecting that he would spend his life overturning its fundamental assumptions. Karl Marx arrived at the University of Berlin in October of 1836, a 17-year-old with romantic ambitions to become a poet and a father, who expected him to study law. What he discovered instead was a philosophical tradition so intoxicating, so totalizing in its claims, that it would consume the next decade of his intellectual life before he finally broke free from its gravitational pull. Berlin in the 1830s was not just a university town, it was the epicenter of German idealism, still radiating the legacy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who had died 5 years earlier, but whose system remained the dominant framework through which educated Germans understood history, consciousness, and reality itself. The young Marx threw himself into this world with characteristic intensity. He abandoned poetry, neglected his legal studies, and spent his nights in beer cellars arguing philosophy with a loose confederation of radical intellectuals who called themselves the Young Hegelians. These were men who revered their master's dialectical method, while growing increasingly uncomfortable with his political conservatism and his metaphysical idealism. They met in smoke-filled rooms, drank cheap wine, argued until dawn, and believed that philosophical clarity could change the world. Marx fit immediately into this culture of intense debate and intellectual combat. His letters from this period crackle with the fervor of someone discovering that ideas could be weapons, that philosophy was not an academic exercise, but a way of grasping reality by its roots. To understand what Marx was absorbing and what he would eventually reject, you need to grasp what Hegel had accomplished. His system was nothing less than an attempt to explain all of reality as the progressive unfolding of Spirit, Geist in German, through time. History, for Hegel, was not a random sequence of events, but a rational process in which spirit gradually came to know itself through its manifestations in human culture, institutions, and thought. Every historical epoch represented a stage in this grand journey of self-realization. Ancient Greece embodied one moment of spirit's development. Medieval Christianity represented another, the modern Prussian state. Hegel suggested with a conservatism that made his radical students wince, might be the culmination of this process. The engine driving this historical progression was the dialectic, a method of thinking that understood development through contradiction and resolution. A thesis generates its own antithesis, and from their conflict emerges a synthesis that preserves what was valuable in both while transcending their opposition. But this synthesis becomes a new thesis, generating its own antithesis, propelling spirit forward in an endless spiral of negation and transcendence. Nothing is fixed. Everything contains the seeds of its own transformation. Reality itself is dynamic, contradictory, always in motion. This was heady stuff for a young radical. The dialectical method suggested that existing institutions were not eternal truths but temporary stages in an ongoing process. If present arrangements contradicted emerging human needs and potentials, that contradiction would necessarily drive transformation. The young Hegelians seized on this implication. Perhaps spirit's next movement would sweep away the authoritarian Prussian monarchy. Perhaps Christianity itself was a phase to be transcended. The method seemed radical even if the master who created it had used it to justify the status quo. But there was a problem at the heart of Hegelianism that Marx could not ignore, though it took him years to articulate it clearly. For Hegel, the ultimate reality was spirit, and material reality was merely spirit's external manifestation. Ideas were not epiphenomena arising from material conditions. They were the fundamental substance of reality itself. History unfolded according to the logic of concepts, not according to how human beings met their material needs. Consciousness determined being, not the other way around. This meant that for Hegel, real change happened first in thought. Philosophy comprehended the rational structure of reality, and social transformation followed from this comprehension. The young Hegelians embraced this thoroughly. They believed that critiquing religious consciousness, exposing the contradictions in political ideology, and achieving philosophical clarity would by itself transform society. Change the ideas and you change the world. Enter Ludwig Feuerbach, whose book The Essence of Christianity appeared in 1841 and detonated like a bomb in young Hegelian circles. Feuerbach was himself a former Hegelian, and he used the master's dialectical method to invert the master's entire system. His argument was elegant and devastating. What if Hegel had everything backwards? What if matter was not the manifestation of spirit, but spirit was the projection of material beings? What if religion, rather than expressing divine truth, was humanity's way of projecting its own essential qualities onto an imagined deity? God did not create humans in his image. Humans created God in theirs. This was not mere atheism. Feuerbach was proposing a comprehensive materialism that relocated the foundation of reality from consciousness to concrete, physical existence. Human beings were not disembodied minds contemplating eternal truths. They were biological organisms with needs, desires, and bodily existence. Consciousness arose from this material foundation, not the other way around. Philosophy needed to descend from the heaven of abstraction and plant itself in the earth of sensuous, living, suffering, acting humanity. Marx encountered Feuerbach's work while living in Paris, exiled from Germany for his radical journalism. The impact was immediate and profound. Here was a way to keep the dialectical method, which Marx recognized as genuinely powerful for understanding change through contradiction, while discarding the idealist metaphysics that imprisoned it. Feuerbach had performed what Marx would later call an inversion, flipping the Hegelian system right side up, but Marx quickly realized that Feuerbach had not gone far enough. Feuerbach's materialism was still abstract, still philosophical. It explained consciousness as arising from human nature, from species being, from the essential characteristics of humans as such. What it did not explain was why consciousness took different forms in different historical periods. Why did feudal lords think differently than Renaissance merchants? Why did factory owners in 19th century Manchester see the world differently than peasants in rural Prussia? Feuerbach's static materialism could not answer these questions. It had no account of history, no way to connect material existence to the specific forms of social organization and production that varied across time and place. This is where Marx made his decisive move, and where dialectical materialism was truly born, though he would never use that term himself. What if you took Hegel's historical dynamism, his understanding that consciousness evolved through stages, but grounded it not in spirit but in actual material activity? What if you took Feuerbach's materialism but made it historical, recognizing that human nature itself was not fixed but shaped by the specific ways humans organized production and reproduced their existence? You would have a framework that was both materialist and dialectical, that understood consciousness as determined by material conditions, while those conditions themselves remained dynamic and contradictory. Marx began working this out in a manuscript he wrote with his new collaborator Friedrich Engels in 1845 and 1846, a sprawling work called The German Ideology that would not be published until the 20th century. The opening sections are a sustained demolition of his former allies, the young Hegelians, for their continued belief that philosophical criticism alone could transform reality. Hitherto men have constantly made up for themselves false conceptions about themselves, about what they are and what they ought to be. Marx wrote with savage irony, skewering philosophers who believed that destroying illusions in thought would destroy real oppression. Against this, Marx insisted that consciousness must be explained by life, not life by consciousness. What we think is shaped by what we do, specifically by how we organize the production of our material existence. Philosophy, religion, ethics, politics, these were not autonomous spheres operating according to their own logic. They were, in a metaphor Marx would develop more fully later, the superstructure rising from an economic base. Change the base and you change everything built upon it. This did not mean Marx rejected philosophy or considered it unimportant. It meant he now understood philosophy itself as a product of specific material conditions, serving specific social functions. Hegelian idealism was not just wrong, it was the characteristic philosophy of a particular class in a particular historical moment, reflecting their experience of the world and their need to justify existing arrangements. The very fact that consciousness could mistake itself as autonomous and self-generating was itself something to be explained through material conditions. Yet Marx never abandoned the dialectical method itself. He recognized in Hegel's dialectic something genuinely valuable, a way of thinking that embraced contradiction, understood development as arising from internal tensions, and refused to see any social arrangement as final. The problem was that Hegel had mystified this method by applying it to abstract spirit rather than concrete social relations. Marx's project was to rescue the dialectical kernel from its idealist shell, to bring this powerful tool down to earth and apply it to actual human society in all its material specificity. This created a permanent tension at the heart of Marx's work, and by extension at the heart of dialectical materialism itself. On one hand, he was insisting that material conditions determined consciousness. On the other hand, he was developing sophisticated theoretical tools, writing dense philosophical works, and arguing that revolutionary consciousness was necessary for social transformation. If consciousness was really just a reflection of material conditions, what was the point of all this intellectual labor? How could critical thought emerge that transcended the limits imposed by current conditions? Marx struggled with this problem throughout his life, and his followers would struggle with it even more intensely. The relationship between consciousness and material reality that Marx was mapping turned out to be far more complex than a simple one-way determination. Consciousness was shaped by material conditions, yes, but it could also grasp those conditions, critique them, and participate in transforming them. This was not a contradiction in the sense of a logical error. It was a dialectical relationship in the sense that both terms mutually influenced each other while remaining distinct. Material conditions set the parameters within which thought operated, but thought could push back against those parameters, especially when contradictions in the material base became acute enough to shake consciousness free from its customary grooves. By the time Marx left Berlin behind, both literally and intellectually, he had completed the first phase of his philosophical journey. He had absorbed Hegel's dialectical method so thoroughly that he would never think any other way. He had embraced Feuerbach's materialism with the fervor of a convert discovering truth after years of mystification, and he had recognized, with increasing clarity, that neither Hegel nor Feuerbach had provided an adequate framework for understanding how societies actually work and how they change. For that, he would need to go beyond philosophy altogether, to study political economy, to investigate the concrete operations of capitalism, to analyze class relations and production processes. But recognizing that material conditions shape thought is only the beginning. The question becomes, what exactly are these material conditions, and how do they change? Marx would find his answer not in philosophy libraries, but in the smoke-filled factories and industrial slums of England. Friedrich Engels came into the world surrounded by contradiction. Born in November of 1820 in the Prussian textile town of Barmen, he grew up watching his father's workers labor 16-hour days in conditions that would have appalled most of bourgeois Europe, had bourgeois Europe bothered to look. The Engels family fortune came from thread and fabric, from the rhythmic clatter of mechanical looms and the cheap labor of men, women and children, whose bodies were consumed as efficiently as the cotton they processed. Young Friedrich was raised to inherit this empire. Instead, he would spend his life trying to dismantle everything it represented. The irony was not lost on Engels himself. He would eventually manage one of his family's factories in Manchester, that great engine room of industrial capitalism, where he spent his days overseeing production and his evenings documenting the human cost with a precision that bordered on rage. He walked through districts where entire families lived in single rooms without windows, where open sewers ran between buildings, where children died of diseases that had no names, because no one with power had bothered to study them. What he witnessed was not the Hegelian march of spirit through history. It was flesh and hunger and early death, arranged in service of profit margins recorded in neat ledgers. In 1844, Engels published The Condition of the Working Class in England. The book did something unusual for philosophical writing of the period. It counted things. It measured the dimensions of workers' rooms, calculated their caloric intake, documented mortality rates district by district. Engels walked the streets with a notebook, interviewed factory workers, collected testimony from doctors who treated industrial injuries. He described how cotton dust filled lungs until breathing became agony, how chemical dyes ate through the skin of textile workers, how the 12-year-old children in the factories moved with the shuffling gait of old men because their growing bones had been bent by constant labor. This was materialism of a different order than Feuerbach had imagined. This was not abstract matter replacing abstract spirit. This was Manchester in 1843, with its life expectancy for workers at 17 years in some districts. This was evidence, and it was damning. Marx had been theorizing about alienated labor in university libraries. Engels had been measuring it with a ruler. When they met for sustained conversation in Paris during August of 1844, the intellectual chemistry was immediate and permanent. Marx brought philosophical rigor and historical breadth. Engels brought factory floors and payroll books. Marx understood how Hegel's dialectic might be inverted. Engels could show you precisely what that inversion looked like when translated into the relationship between mill owner and mill worker. Their 10 days of conversation in those Paris cafes produced a collaboration that would last until Marx's death nearly 40 years later. Engels would support Marx financially for most of that time, allowing Marx to write while Engels managed cotton mills and wrote articles for English newspapers. The arrangement was strange enough that it invited mockery. Here was the great theorist of proletarian revolution, dependent on income extracted from exploited workers by his best friend. But the partnership worked because each provided what the other lacked. Marx needed time to think and write. Engels needed Marx's theoretical genius to make sense of what he had witnessed in Manchester. Together they began constructing what would eventually be called historical materialism. The term requires precision. Historical materialism was their application of materialist philosophy to human history and social organization. It claimed that the economic base of any society, how people produce and distribute goods, determines the legal, political, and ideological superstructure. Feudalism produced feudal law and feudal religion. Capitalism produces liberal democracy and Protestant work ethics. Change the mode of production, and everything else changes in turn. Dialectical materialism, on the other hand, was a broader metaphysical framework that would be systematized later, primarily by Russian Marxists after both founders had died. It extended the dialectical method beyond human society to nature itself, claiming that contradiction and transformation operated as universal principles. Marx and Engels never used the phrase dialectical materialism. They were more cautious, more focused on what could be demonstrated through historical analysis. But historical materialism was ambitious enough. It suggested that every age misunderstands itself, that people always believe their current arrangements to be natural or divinely ordained, when in fact they are merely the temporary outcome of material conditions. The Roman senator genuinely believed slavery was natural. The medieval monk genuinely believed the feudal order reflected God's plan. The 19th century factory owner genuinely believed that paying starvation wages was simple economic rationality. Historical materialism claimed to see through all of it. The collaboration crystallized in the German ideology, written between 1845 and 1846. The manuscript ran to hundreds of pages, and no publisher would touch it during their lifetimes. Marx would later joke that they had left it to be gnawed by the mice, having achieved their main purpose of self-clarification. But in that unpublished manuscript, they laid out the core of their position with remarkable clarity. Consciousness does not determine life. Life determines consciousness. Human beings begin by needing to eat, to find shelter, to reproduce. How they organize these activities creates everything else: their laws, their religions, their philosophies, their very sense of self. This was materialism without apology. The document dripped with contempt for philosophers who thought history was driven by ideas, who believed that changing how people think would change how they live. Marx and Engels argued the reverse. Show them a society where workers own the means of production, and they would show you a society where workers think differently about property. But start with changed consciousness and leave the factory ownership intact, and nothing happens except some pleasant fantasies among intellectuals. Engels brought something else to the partnership beyond money and empirical evidence. He brought optimism. Marx could spiral into depression, could spend weeks in his study paralyzed by poverty and physical illness, could write with a bitterness that burned the page. Engels believed. He believed that history was moving towards something better, that the contradictions of capitalism would eventually force its transformation, that the nightmare he had documented in Manchester was not permanent. This was not naive faith. It was a conviction built from the same evidence that produced his despair. If conditions were this bad, and getting worse, then surely they could not continue indefinitely. Something had to break. They were wrong about some things. As it turned out, revolution did not emerge where they expected it. The working class in advanced capitalist countries often developed consciousness very different from what Marx and Engels predicted, but they were right about enough to matter. They were right that economic relations shaped far more of human life than most philosophers had acknowledged. They were right that ideas do not float free of material interests. They were right that every age tells itself comforting stories that justify its arrangement of power and wealth. and they were right that systems which generate immense suffering and immense contradiction do not typically reform themselves peacefully. The partnership between Marx and Engels created something genuinely new in the history of philosophy. It was not just materialism. Materialism was old, stretching back to the ancient Greeks. It was not just dialectical thinking. Hegel had provided that. It was the fusion, dialectical transformation applied to material conditions. Historical change understood as emerging from economic contradictions rather than the evolution of ideas. It was philosophy that smelled of factory smoke and kept the books of human suffering in double-entry columns. It was thought that considered itself inseparable from the world it described, that claimed you could not understand capitalism from outside capitalism, that insisted theory must connect to revolutionary practice or remain mere cleverness. With philosophy grounded in industrial reality, Marx and Engels faced a new challenge: how to explain not just current conditions, but the entire sweep of human history through a materialist lens. They needed a theory of historical motion itself. In 1859, in the preface to his work, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx offered what would become perhaps the most concise statement of his entire theoretical framework. The legal relations and forms of state, he wrote, cannot be understood through themselves, nor through what he called the so-called general development of the human mind. They have their roots rather in the material conditions of life. At the heart of these material conditions sits what Marx termed the economic structure of society, the real foundation upon which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. This architectural metaphor, base and superstructure, foundation and edifice, would become the organizing principle for understanding how societies actually function. It represented more than a clever analogy. Marx was proposing that every society could be anatomized, laid open like a body on an examination table, its working parts identified and their relationships mapped. And what such an anatomy would reveal, he insisted, was that the grand edifices of law, politics, religion, philosophy, and culture all rest upon and are shaped by a foundation most people never consciously examine: the way a society organizes production. The economic base consists of two intimately connected elements. First, the means of production, the physical tools, technologies, factories, land, raw materials, and infrastructure through which a society produces what it needs to survive and flourish. A feudal manor operates with different means than a textile factory, and a textile factory operates with different means than a modern automated warehouse. But means of production alone do not constitute the base. Equally crucial are the relations of production, the social arrangements determining who owns these means, who works them, and how the fruits of labor get distributed, who owns the land, who owns the factory, who works for wages, and who collects profit. These relations are not natural or eternal. They are historically specific, varying dramatically between slave societies, feudal arrangements, and capitalist economies. Together, means and relations of production form the economic base, the foundation upon which everything else in society is constructed, and rising from this foundation comes the superstructure, the vast architecture of institutions, ideas, and cultural forms that a society produces, legal systems that define property rights and enforce contracts, political institutions from monarchies to parliaments, religious doctrines and ecclesiastical hierarchies, philosophical movements and schools of thought, artistic traditions and aesthetic standards, educational systems and family structures, the entire realm of what we call culture, belief, and institutional life. The relationship between base and superstructure is not merely one of connection, but of determination. The economic foundation does not simply exist alongside these institutions and ideas. It shapes them, generates them, sets their boundaries and possibilities. The legal system of a feudal society, with its elaborate gradations of hereditary obligation and tied labor, reflects and reinforces feudal relations of production. The legal system of capitalism, with its emphasis on contract freedom, private property rights, and formal equality before law, reflects and reinforces capitalist relations. The law appears neutral, universal, simply rational, but examine its content, Marx argued, and you find it codifying specific economic arrangements, making them seem natural and inevitable. Consider religion. In 1844, Marx had written that religious suffering is at once the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion, he continued, is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. This phrase, endlessly repeated and often misunderstood, was not merely dismissive. Marx was arguing that religion arises from material conditions of deprivation and powerlessness. People create heavenly consolations because earthly existence offers so little consolation. The specific form religion takes, its doctrines about poverty being blessed, about rewards in the afterlife, about obedience to authority being divinely ordained, these reflect and reinforce existing economic arrangements. The superstructure of religious belief grows from the base of economic organization. Philosophy itself does not escape this analysis. The great idealist systems, with their emphasis on mind, spirit, and eternal truths, arise in societies where a leisured class has the luxury of contemplating abstractions. The questions philosophers ask, the problems they consider worth solving, the very categories through which they think, all bear the fingerprints of their economic moment. When Hegel wrote about the march of spirit through history, he was, whether he knew it or not, expressing in idealist form the actual dynamics of emerging bourgeois society. The ideas that seem most timeless and universal turn out, under this analysis, to be time-bound and particular, growing from specific soil. This model presents a direct challenge to how most people understand their own beliefs and the institutions they inhabit. We experience our thoughts as our own, freely chosen. We see legal systems as rational responses to universal human needs for order. We treat cultural traditions as autonomous developments of human creativity. The base superstructure model asks us to recognize that this experience of autonomy might itself be an illusion generated by the base, that we are thinking thoughts and building institutions that serve economic arrangements we did not choose and may not even perceive. Yet even as Marx and Engels developed this framework, they confronted an immediate problem. The model seemed to reduce everything to economics. Does a poem exist only to reflect class relations? Is every philosophical argument just economic interest in disguise? Does nothing possess any independence from the economic foundation? This reductionism, the flattening of all human activity into mere epiphenomena of economic base, troubled even sympathetic readers. It seemed to drain human culture of meaning, to treat consciousness as nothing but passive reflection of material conditions. Marx himself proved more nuanced than many of his followers. In his analysis of specific historical situations, he acknowledged that political struggles, ideological conflicts, and cultural movements possessed their own dynamics, their own relative autonomy. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, his examination of the French coup of 1851, shows political actors motivated by tradition, by fear, by miscalculation, not simply by economic interest. His literary criticism reveals genuine appreciation for Greek tragedy and Shakespeare, not merely as ideological products, but as artistic achievements. The man who wrote the theory sometimes wrote as though culture possessed depths his own theory struggled to accommodate. Engels, outliving Marx by 12 years, found himself repeatedly defending the base superstructure model against charges of crude reductionism. In a remarkable series of letters written in the 1890s, he clarified and, some argue, significantly revised the theory. Writing to Joseph Bloch in September of 1890, Engels acknowledged that he and Marx had sometimes overstated their case. According to the materialist conception of history, he wrote, "The ultimately determining element is the production and reproduction of real life. More than this, neither Marx nor he had ever asserted." If somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. Engels went further. The political, juridical, philosophical, religious, literary, and artistic development rest upon economic development. But all these react upon one another and also upon the economic base. It is not that the economic position is the cause, and alone active, while everything else is only a passive effect. There is rather an interaction on the basis of economic necessity, which ultimately always asserts itself. The superstructure, in other words, can influence the base. Law can shape economic development. Religious movements can redirect production. Political revolutions can transform economic relations. The determination flows primarily from base to superstructure, but not exclusively or mechanically. This acknowledgement opened space for what later Marxists would call relative autonomy, the idea that superstructural elements possess their own logic, their own inertia, their own capacity to affect the base from which they arose. It made the model more sophisticated, more capable of accounting for historical complexity, but it also raised questions about what distinguished this enriched version from simply saying that everything affects everything else, a truism that sacrifices theoretical precision for empirical adequacy. The debate about base and superstructure would rage throughout the 20th century. Was it a profound insight into how power perpetuates itself through institutions and ideas that appear neutral? Or was it a reductionist oversimplification that failed to grasp the genuine autonomy of culture, politics, and human consciousness? Different Marxist traditions would answer differently, some emphasizing economic determinism, others exploring the spaces of superstructural independence. What remained constant was the core provocation that the ideas and institutions we take for granted, that feel natural and necessary, might be neither natural nor necessary, that they arise from specific economic arrangements and serve specific economic interests. That understanding society requires looking beneath the surface of law and culture to the foundation of production relations, that what we think of as the realm of freedom, thought, culture, politics, might be more constrained by material necessity than we care to admit. Yet this architectural model, elegant as it appears, raises a troubling question. If the base determines everything, how does anything ever change? The answer lies in understanding contradiction, not as error, but as engine. A single thread runs through all of Hegel's philosophy, and once you see it, everything else falls into place. The thread is this: contradiction is not a sign that thinking has gone wrong. It is the sign that thinking has finally begun to grasp reality itself. This was not the conventional view in 1830s Germany or anywhere else. Classical logic, inherited from Aristotle, insisted that contradictions mark the boundary of coherent thought. If you arrived at a statement that something both was and was not the case simultaneously, you had made an error. You needed to go back and correct your reasoning. The law of non-contradiction stood as philosophy's bedrock. I cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same respect. But Hegel looked at history and saw contradiction everywhere, not errors in thinking, but the actual structure of how things unfold. A society built on slavery contained within itself the seeds of its own transformation. The master who depended entirely on the slave for his identity as master was, in a genuine sense, enslaved by that very dependency. Freedom that existed only through the domination of others was not yet real freedom. These were not logical puzzles to be resolved through clearer definitions. They were contradictions woven into the fabric of social reality, and their resolution came not through better reasoning but through historical transformation. The dialectical method emerged from this insight. Every concept, every institution, every historical formation contained within itself an internal opposition, a negation that would eventually assert itself and force the original form to evolve into something new. Thesis meets antithesis, and from their conflict emerges synthesis, which itself becomes a new thesis, carrying forward elements of both while transcending their opposition. History, for Hegel, moved through these waves of contradiction and resolution, each stage necessary, each containing the seeds of its own supersession. The engine was negation, but negation in a specific sense, not simple destruction, but determinate negation that preserved even as it overcame. When the synthesis emerged, it did not simply erase what came before. It aufheben, a German word that means simultaneously to cancel, to preserve, and to raise to a higher level. The movement was not circular but spiral, returning to similar questions at higher levels of development. Marx absorbed all of this during his student years in Berlin. The dialectical method struck him as genuinely profound, a way of thinking that could grasp movement and transformation rather than treating reality as a collection of static objects. But he became convinced that Hegel had located the dialectic in the wrong place. For Hegel, contradictions existed in the realm of Geist, of spirit or mind working itself out through history. Ideas contradicted each other, and human history was the story of consciousness coming to recognize itself through these conceptual struggles. The actual material world, the factories, the farms, the tools and techniques of production, were simply external manifestations of inner spiritual development. Marx inverted this entirely. Contradictions did not float in the realm of pure thought. They existed in actual social relations, in the concrete organization of how people produced their material existence. The contradiction was not between concepts, but between the forces of production, the actual technical capacity of society to produce goods, and the relations of production, who owned what, who controlled the labor process, who appropriated the surplus. Look at capitalism, Marx argued, and you will see this contradiction in its starkest form. Production had become thoroughly socialized. Hundreds of workers cooperated in vast factories, each performing specialized tasks in an integrated process. Raw materials flowed in from global supply chains. The product itself was created through collective labor, through cooperation on a scale unprecedented in human history. Yet the fruits of this socialized production were appropriated privately. The factory owner, who might never set foot in the facility, claimed ownership of everything produced. The workers who actually created the goods had no claim to them beyond their wages, determined not by the value they added, but by whatever the owner could get away with paying. This was not a logical contradiction you could resolve through clearer thinking. It was a material contradiction embedded in the structure of economic relations, and like all contradictions in Marx's dialectical framework, it would intensify over time. The intensification followed its own logic. As capitalism developed, production became ever more socialized. Corporations merged, creating larger and larger enterprises. The division of labor grew more specialized and interdependent. Global trade networks meant that even the simplest commodity embodied labor from dozens of countries. Meanwhile, ownership concentrated in fewer hands. The contradiction between socialized production and private appropriation did not soften with capitalism's maturity, it sharpened. Here Marx deployed a dialectical principle that would later be formalized as the transformation of quantity into quality. Changes accumulate gradually. More workers, bigger factories, greater concentration of capital. Each individual change seems like more of the same, a quantitative increase. But at a certain threshold, quantitative changes produce qualitative transformation. Water heated gradually remains liquid, remains fundamentally the same substance, until it reaches 100 degrees Celsius, then phase transition. It becomes steam, something qualitatively different with different properties and behaviors. So too with social contradictions. Incremental reforms might ease specific symptoms. Wages might rise, working hours might decrease, safety conditions might improve, but these quantitative adjustments cannot resolve the underlying contradiction. The structure itself, socialized production yoked to private appropriation, cannot be reformed away. At a certain point, the contradiction must resolve through qualitative transformation. Revolution, not reform, becomes historically necessary. This was not wishful thinking dressed up as philosophy, Marx insisted. It was reading the dialectical logic already present in material reality. Just as the master-slave relationship in ancient societies contained contradictions that eventually made feudalism historically necessary, and feudalism contained contradictions that made capitalism historically necessary, so capitalism contained contradictions that would make socialism historically necessary. The dialectic offered another principle, the interpenetration of opposites. Things that appeared to be pure opposites actually defined each other, contained each other, could not exist without each other. There was no bourgeoisie without a proletariat, no capital without labor, no private property without the dispossessed. The contradiction was not between two separate things that happened to come into conflict. It was internal to the relationship itself. Each pole of the opposition created and sustained the other while simultaneously undermining it. And here the dialectic became truly radical. If contradictions intensified until they forced qualitative transformation, and if capitalism's fundamental contradiction was becoming more acute rather than less, then capitalism was producing its own gravediggers. The very process that concentrated wealth also concentrated workers in factories, teaching them cooperation and collective action. The very system that depended on exploiting labor also educated that labor in industrial discipline and organization. The bourgeoisie, in developing the forces of production to unprecedented heights, was creating the material and social conditions for its own supersession. This movement followed what would later be called the negation of the negation. Primitive communal ownership of resources had been negated by private property, first in slavery, then feudalism, then capitalism. But this negation would itself be negated, producing not a simple return to primitive communism, but communism at a higher level, preserving the productive advances of capitalism while transcending its exploitative relations. The spiral of history returned to communal ownership, but now with the technological and organizational capacity to make it genuinely liberatory rather than merely subsistent. Critics would later charge that this entire framework was deterministic, that it reduced human agency to the working out of inevitable historical laws. Marx would have rejected this characterization. The dialectic was not a mechanical process that ground forward regardless of human action. It was precisely through human action, through class struggle, through revolutionary practice, that contradictions actually resolved themselves. The dialectic described the logic of historical motion, but history still required historical actors. Yet the framework undeniably suggested directionality. Contradictions intensified. They did not simply persist indefinitely. They pressed toward resolution. And the resolution, while requiring human agency, was not arbitrary. You could not resolve the contradiction of capitalism by reimposing feudalism or returning to primitive communism. The dialectical movement was forward, off-haben, preserving and transcending simultaneously. This is what made dialectical materialism simultaneously so compelling and so troubling. It offered a way to understand social change that was neither pure contingency nor mechanistic determinism. It suggested that history had a logic, that contradictions really did press toward particular resolutions, that capitalism really did contain the seeds of its own transformation. But it also raised questions that Marx never fully answered. How could you tell the difference between a contradiction that was truly fundamental and one that could be reformed away? Who decided when quantitative changes had accumulated sufficiently to require qualitative transformation? And if consciousness was determined by material conditions, how could people achieve the revolutionary consciousness necessary to transform those very conditions? These tensions would haunt dialectical materialism throughout its history. But for Marx, in the 1840s and 50s, the power of the dialectical framework seemed undeniable. It explained why piecemeal reforms could never satisfy working-class aspirations. It revealed why capitalism, for all its productive achievements, could not be the final form of economic organization. It showed why socialism was not a utopian dream, but a historical necessity emerging from capitalism's own contradictions. But contradictions do not float in abstract space. They manifest in the lived conflict between human groups with incompatible interests. This is where dialectical materialism becomes a theory of struggle. The contradictions embedded in economic structures are not abstractions that float above human experience. They manifest in the lived antagonism between groups whose interests cannot be reconciled within the existing system. For Marx and Engels, this was the crucial insight that transformed dialectical materialism from philosophical framework into revolutionary program. Contradictions resolve themselves through human conflict, not through logical argument, not through moral persuasion, not through gradual reform, but through struggle between classes whose very existence depends on incompatible relationships to the means of production. The Communist Manifesto, published in February of 1848 as revolutions erupted across Europe, opens with a declaration that still unsettles. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, not the history of ideas progressing toward enlightenment, not the history of great individuals shaping destiny. not even the history of economic development in the abstract. The history of class struggles, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, oppressor and oppressed, standing in constant opposition, carrying on an uninterrupted fight that each time ended either in revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. This was not merely provocative rhetoric, it represented a complete reimagining of what drives historical change. Where others saw technological innovation, cultural evolution, or the gradual expansion of human knowledge as the engines of progress, Marx and Engels identified a starker mechanism, the collision of groups whose material interests made accommodation impossible. History moved forward not despite conflict, but through it. Each stable social order contained within itself the seeds of antagonism that would eventually tear it apart. But what precisely constituted a class? Here Marx offered a definition that departed sharply from common usage. Classes were not defined by income levels, though wealth certainly correlated with class position. They were not defined by status or prestige, though these too followed class lines. A class was defined by its relationship to the means of production, the tools, resources, and systems through which society creates the material necessities of life. Do you own the means of production, or do you work for those who own them? Do you live by employing others, or by selling your own labor? These questions determined class membership more fundamentally than any amount of money or social standing. In ancient Rome, the fundamental antagonism existed between masters who owned human beings as property and slaves who owned nothing, not even themselves. The master's wealth, power, and leisure depended entirely on extracting labor from those who had no choice but to provide it. The slave's survival depended on submitting to this extraction. No amount of kind treatment or philosophical sophistication could resolve this contradiction. The system required one class to dominate another absolutely. Feudal Europe rearranged this antagonism into new forms. Lords owned land, the primary means of production in an agricultural economy. Serfs worked that land, bound to it by law and custom, surrendering a portion of their harvest in exchange for protection and the right to subsist. The relationship was hierarchical and coercive, but it differed from slavery in crucial ways. Serfs possessed limited rights, maintained their own households, could not be bought and sold separately from the land. Yet the fundamental contradiction remained. Lords lived from surplus extracted from serf labor, while serfs survived on what remained after that extraction. Each mode of production, Marx argued, generated its characteristic class antagonisms as inevitably as a machine generates friction. You could not have feudalism without lords and serfs. You could not have ancient slave economies without masters and slaves. And you could not have capitalism without bourgeoisie and proletariat, owners of capital and sellers of labor power. The bourgeoisie, that revolutionary class that had overthrown feudalism and remade the world in its image, owned the factories, the machinery, the raw materials. The proletariat owned nothing but their capacity to work. Each morning, workers sold hours of their lives to capitalists in exchange for wages. Each day, capitalists extracted more value from that labor than they paid for it, the famous surplus value that Marx would anatomize with ruthless precision in Capital. The workers' poverty and the capitalist's wealth arose from the same process, two sides of a single exploitative relationship. But here, dialectical materialism revealed something that conventional economic analysis missed. These relationships were not merely unfair or unfortunate arrangements that good policy might ameliorate. They were contradictions in the dialectical sense, opposing forces whose tension must eventually produce transformation. The capitalist system socialized production to an unprecedented degree. Hundreds or thousands of workers collaborated in vast factories to produce commodities. Yet the fruits of this collective effort were appropriated privately by individual owners. Socialized production, private appropriation, a contradiction that intensified as capitalism developed. Class struggle, then, was not an unfortunate byproduct of industrialization or a result of inadequate regulation. It was the form that dialectical contradiction took in human society. The abstract tension between socialized production and private appropriation manifested concretely in strikes, lockouts, political battles, revolutionary uprisings. When workers organized unions, they were not simply pursuing higher wages, they were expressing in practical form the fundamental incompatibility between their interests and those of capital. When capitalists deployed police to break strikes, they were not merely defending property, they were acting out the logic of a system that required domination of labor by capital. Each previous mode of production had resolved its class antagonisms through transformation into a new mode with new classes and new contradictions. Slavery gave way to feudalism, feudalism to capitalism. But capitalism, Marx and Engels argued, contained a unique possibility. It was creating the class whose interests aligned with abolishing class itself. The proletariat, propertyless and exploited, could emancipate itself only by abolishing the system of property relations that defined it. Unlike serfs who might dream of becoming small landholders, or guild journeymen who aspired to master status, industrial workers could not bootstrap their way into the bourgeoisie. The very structure of industrial capitalism, requiring massive concentrations of capital, made such individual escape increasingly impossible. The proletariat's liberation required not reshuffling who owned what within the existing system, but transcending that system entirely. Here was the negation of the negation that Hegel had described in abstract terms, now appearing in concrete historical form. Capitalism had negated feudalism, replacing hereditary hierarchy with market relations. The proletarian revolution would negate capitalism, abolishing the class system that capitalism itself had universalized. But this second negation would not simply restore what came before, it would create something genuinely new, a classless society where the means of production belonged to all, where no group could live by extracting surplus from another's labor. This was not utopian dreaming, Marx insisted, but scientific analysis of historical tendencies already in motion. Capitalism was concentrating ownership, proletarianizing ever more of the population, creating the material conditions for collective ownership of highly socialized production. The class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat would intensify as these contradictions sharpened, until revolutionary transformation became not merely desirable but necessary. Whether this analysis captured something profound about social change or imposed a too neat schema onto messy historical reality would become the central debate about Marxism for the next century and a half. But for Marx and Engels in 1848, watching revolutions erupt across Europe, it seemed they had identified the motor of history itself, not ideas descending from philosophy, not technology emerging from human ingenuity, but the concrete struggle between classes whose incompatible interests drove society from one form to another. This vision of history as class warfare raises profound questions about human agency. If material conditions and class position determine consciousness, where does choice enter? Can individuals escape their historical programming? The factory worker rises before dawn, dresses in the dark, and walks through cold streets to a building where he does not own the machines, does not control the product, does not determine the pace of his own hands. At day's end, he receives wages that seem fair because everyone around him receives similar wages. He believes himself free because he chose this factory over that one, this shift over another. He votes for representatives who promise prosperity through the very system that exhausts him. When radicals speak of exploitation, he hears ingratitude. When they mention revolution, he hears madness. He is, in the language Marx developed, suffering from false consciousness, seeing reality through a lens ground by the very forces that subordinate him. This concept emerged not as a term Marx himself used frequently, but as a framework implicit throughout his mature work. The idea crystallized most clearly in the German ideology, written with Engels during 1845 and 46, but left unpublished, consigned to what Marx later called the gnawing criticism of the mice. There, in passages dense with sarcasm, directed at their former young Hegelian colleagues, Marx and Engels argued that consciousness does not determine life, but life determines consciousness. More precisely, the material conditions of existence, who owns what, who labors for whom, how surplus value flows, shape the categories through which people understand their world. False consciousness, then, is not stupidity. It is not ignorance that better education might remedy. It represents a systematic misrecognition built into the structure of social relations themselves. The worker who believes his poverty results from personal failure rather than systemic exploitation has not failed to think clearly. He has thought with perfect clarity, using the concepts his society provides. Those concepts: individual responsibility, fair exchange, freedom of contract, obscure the structural relationship between his labor and another's profit. They make visible what serves the existing order while rendering invisible what might challenge it. Marx described ideology as a camera obscura, borrowing the term from the optical device that projects images upside down. In ideology, reality appears inverted. Ideas seem to shape material conditions rather than emerging from them. Religion appears to comfort the poor through divine will, rather than functioning to make poverty bearable. Law seems to embody timeless justice rather than codifying property relations. Philosophy poses as pursuit of eternal truth rather than reflecting the intellectual possibilities of its historical moment. The inversion is not accidental. It serves a function. Every epoch's ruling ideas are the ideas of its ruling class. Marx stated this principle with characteristic bluntness in the German ideology, but the mechanism deserved elaboration. How exactly do the ideas of one class become the common sense of all classes, including those whose interests those ideas betray? The answer lay in control, not crude censorship, though that played its role, but something more subtle, and therefore more powerful. The ruling class controls the means of mental production as surely as it controls the means of material production. It owns the printing presses and determines what gets published. It endows the universities and influences what gets taught. It funds the churches and shapes what gets preached. It establishes the schools where children learn which questions to ask and which to leave unasked. This control need not be conspiratorial. Editors publish what seems reasonable. Professors teach what seems true. Ministers preach what seems righteous. But reasonableness, truth, and righteousness bear the watermark of the social order that sustains the institutions producing them. Consider the concept of private property itself. To someone born into a world where property relations are ancient and established, the right to own land, to profit from another's labor, to bequeath accumulated wealth, these appear natural, perhaps even ordained by God, or justified by nature. Alternative arrangements seem utopian at best, tyrannical at worst. Yet property relations are historical constructs, relatively recent in human experience, enforced by law and ultimately by violence. Ideology makes these contingent arrangements appear inevitable. These power relations appear legitimate. These historical constructions appear natural. Religion offered Marx his clearest example. He called it the opium of the people, not, as often misunderstood, in pure condemnation, but in recognition of its analgesic function. Opium dulls pain without removing its cause. Religion consoles the suffering by promising justice in an afterlife, making earthly injustice bearable. It inverts the real relationship. Humans create God in their image, then experience God as creator, who determines human fate. The impoverished worker who accepts his poverty as God's will, who anticipates heavenly reward for earthly obedience, who sees the wealthy as blessed rather than exploitative. This worker has internalized an ideology that serves interests not his own. But here dialectical materialism encountered a paradox that would haunt it through all subsequent development. If material conditions determine consciousness, if the base shapes the superstructure with iron necessity, if the exploited worker's understanding is systematically distorted by the very relations that exploit him, then how does revolutionary consciousness ever emerge? If workers are ideologically locked into bourgeois values, how do they break free? If the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, how do counter-ideas arise? Marx could not appeal to some pure realm of reason untainted by material conditions. That would be idealism, the very error he had spent years refuting. He could not claim philosophers or intellectuals simply think their way to truth. That would grant ideas autonomous power, another idealist lapse. He could not argue that some individuals possess special insight, a natural immunity to ideology. that would undermine the whole materialist framework. His solution lay in contradictions themselves. Material conditions do determine consciousness, but material conditions contain internal contradictions that intensify over time. As capitalism develops, these contradictions become harder to ignore, more difficult to explain away with ideological formulas. The worker who loses his job to mechanization can be told once, twice, perhaps 3 times that better days lie ahead through hard work and faith in the system. But when mechanization becomes pervasive, when employment itself becomes precarious, when the gap between promise and reality widens past a certain threshold, ideology cracks. Revolutionary consciousness emerges not from pure thought, but from the collision between ideological explanation and lived experience. The ideology claims the system is fair. Experience demonstrates otherwise. The ideology promises prosperity through individual effort. Reality delivers impoverishment despite exhausting labor. The ideology depicts the worker as free. The worker's actual dependence on wage labor becomes undeniable. At some point, the contradictions between what ideology says and what life shows become too stark to reconcile. This is why Marx believed crisis was necessary for revolution, not because he wished suffering on workers, because suffering under certain conditions breaks through ideology. The intensification of contradictions, falling wages, lengthening workdays, economic crashes, the visible concentration of wealth, creates circumstances where the ideological lens shatters and workers see the system as it actually operates. Class consciousness emerges when material conditions make false consciousness untenable. Yet this solution generated as many questions as it answered. It suggested a mechanical process. Contradictions intensify. Ideology breaks, revolution follows. But history showed workers often responded to crisis by intensifying their commitment to existing systems, by scapegoating vulnerable groups, by embracing authoritarian promises to restore a mythic past. The relationship between material conditions and consciousness proved far less deterministic than the theory implied. Moreover, the concept of false consciousness carried troubling implications for revolutionary practice. If most workers suffer from systematic misrecognition, if their own understanding of their interests cannot be trusted, then who determines true consciousness? The answer, in practice, became the revolutionary vanguard, the enlightened few who had somehow escaped ideological distortion and could guide the benighted masses. This opened the door to authoritarianism, dressed in liberationist rhetoric, to parties that claimed to represent workers while overriding workers' actual expressed preferences. The theory of ideology opened dialectical materialism to charges of determinism and conspiracy thinking. But its defenders argue it reveals something genuine about how power sustains itself through belief systems. These tensions would explode in debates about the relationship between theory and practice. In the spring of 1845, Karl Marx sat in a Brussels apartment, scribbling 11 brief theses into a notebook. He had been expelled from Paris, and these fragments, written hastily, never intended for publication, would not see print for another 40 years. The 11th thesis contained just 13 words in German, but they encapsulated what Marx believed separated his philosophy from everything that had come before. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This was not merely a call to political engagement. It was an epistemological revolution disguised as a slogan. Marx was claiming that genuine understanding could not be achieved through contemplation alone. Knowledge and transformation were not sequential, first understand, then act, but dialectically unified. The act of changing the world was simultaneously the act of understanding it. He gave this unity a name borrowed from Aristotle, but filled with new meaning: praxis. Praxis, as Marx conceived it, meant something far more sophisticated than practice in the ordinary sense. It was not the application of theory, as if theory were a blueprint and practice mere construction. Rather, praxis dissolved the boundary between thinking and doing. It was theory-informed action that simultaneously tested and transformed the theory informing it. You could not truly understand capitalism by studying it from an armchair. You understood it through the attempt to overthrow it, because that attempt revealed which aspects of your theory corresponded to reality and which were idealist fantasies. This represented Marx's answer to a problem that had plagued philosophy since Plato: the relationship between knowledge and action, between the eternal and the temporal, between what ought to be and what is. Traditional philosophy placed contemplation above action, theory above practice. Even Hegel, for all his dialectical sophistication, saw philosophy as arriving after the fact, the owl of Minerva spreading its wings only at dusk, understanding history once it had already unfolded. Marx rejected this entirely. Philosophy that merely interpreted was not just incomplete, it was fundamentally mistaken about its own nature. The German ideology, written during these same months with Engels, elaborated this insight. Consciousness does not determine life. Life determines consciousness. But this determination was not mechanical causation in one direction. Human beings were shaped by material conditions. Certainly, the factory worker's consciousness emerged from the daily experience of alienated labor, of selling hours for wages, of producing wealth that belonged to others. Yet humans also shaped those conditions through their activity. The same worker, organizing with others, striking, seizing the factory, this activity transformed both the material conditions and the consciousness that had seemed fixed by those conditions. Here was Marx's solution to the determinism problem that haunted materialism. If material conditions determine consciousness, how can consciousness ever break free to imagine alternatives? How can revolution occur if our thoughts are products of the very system we need to overcome? Praxis resolved this apparent paradox by rejecting the premise of unidirectional causation. Humans were both determined and determining. We were products of circumstances and heredity, yes, but we were also agents who modified circumstances and created new conditions for future generations. The brilliance of this formulation lay in how it preserved human agency without retreating into idealism. You could not simply think your way to a different society. Consciousness did not shape reality directly, but neither were you trapped by circumstances. Collective action grounded in material interests and organized strategically could rupture existing structures and create new ones. The proletariat was not free in an abstract sense, but it possessed real power derived from its position in production. Withdraw labor, seize the means of production, and the entire edifice of property relations shook. Revolutionary practice thus became both effect and cause. It was an effect of capitalism's internal contradictions. Workers organized because their conditions forced them to, but it was simultaneously a cause that transformed those conditions. Successful organization changed power relations, which changed what was possible, which changed consciousness itself. The revolution was not something that happened after consciousness had been fully prepared. The revolution was the process through which adequate consciousness emerged. This had profound implications for strategy. It meant you could not wait until the masses achieved perfect theoretical understanding before acting. Action and understanding developed together. A strike taught lessons about power that no pamphlet could convey. A failed uprising revealed tactical errors and structural limits more clearly than any analysis conducted in safety. Praxis was pedagogy. It educated through involvement. Yet this formulation opened Marx to a dangerous question that would haunt Marxism for the next century. If most workers suffered from false consciousness, believing bourgeois ideology about individual advancement and natural hierarchies, who possessed the theoretical clarity to guide revolutionary praxis, if understanding emerged from action but action required understanding, where did the process begin? Marx believed the answer lay in the objective position of the proletariat. Workers did not need perfect theory because their daily experience contradicted bourgeois ideology. The capitalist said everyone could rise through individual effort, but the worker experienced systematic exploitation. The capitalist celebrated freedom, but the worker knew the compulsion of sell your labor or starve. Material conditions themselves were pedagogical, teaching lessons that theory could clarify but not create from nothing. Still, Marx also recognized that some individuals achieved theoretical insight ahead of the masses. The Communist Manifesto addressed itself to the more advanced section of the working class, and acknowledged that some bourgeois intellectuals understanding historical trajectories joined the proletarian cause. This created space for a vanguard, a group that combined theoretical sophistication with organizational capacity. The danger here was subtle but enormous. If revolutionary consciousness required both material conditions and theoretical work, and if most workers lacked time or training for theoretical work, then perhaps an enlightened minority needed to lead. Perhaps they needed to guide workers toward their own objective interests the workers themselves might not yet recognize. This was not Marx claiming a dictatorial elite should rule, but the logical structure was there, dormant, waiting for future Marxists to develop it in directions Marx might not have intended. Lenin would later expand this logic in What Is to Be Done, arguing that workers spontaneously developed only trade union consciousness, demands for better wages and conditions within capitalism. Revolutionary consciousness, he claimed, had to be brought to workers from outside by professional revolutionaries equipped with scientific theory. This was still praxis in Lenin's framing. The party tested its theory through practice, learned from defeats, adjusted tactics. But the relationship between vanguard and masses had shifted. The unity of theory and action now seemed to require a division of labor. Some people primarily theorized, others primarily acted, with the former guiding the latter. Marx would have recognized both the danger and the necessity in this formulation. He had witnessed how workers' movements, left to spontaneous development, often settled for reforms that stabilized capitalism rather than transcending it. He knew that achieving revolutionary consciousness required more than immediate experience. It required historical perspective, economic analysis, strategic thinking. Yet he also knew that any party claiming to possess consciousness on behalf of workers risked becoming a new ruling class, imposing its vision rather than facilitating workers' self-emancipation. The concept of praxis was supposed to prevent exactly this split. If theory and practice were truly unified, then theorists had to be practitioners, and practitioners had to be theorists. The party was not an elite imposing understanding, but an organizational form through which workers educated themselves through struggle. The test of correct theory was not logical consistency, but practical success. Did this analysis help us win? But what constituted winning, and who decided? If the party's theoretical analysis said workers needed X, but workers themselves demanded Y, whose understanding prevailed? Praxis provided no clear answer because it assumed that material conditions, theoretical clarity, and revolutionary action would converge. When they diverged, when workers organized for reformist goals, when material conditions seemed to worsen consciousness rather than sharpen it, when revolutionary action failed, the elegant unity of praxis fractured into competing interpretations. Some Marxists concluded that material conditions had not yet matured. Others concluded that false consciousness ran deeper than anticipated. Still, others began questioning whether the theory itself might need fundamental revision. Each position could claim fidelity to praxis. Each involved testing ideas against reality, but they drew opposite conclusions from the same evidence. The enduring power of praxis as a concept lay not in resolving these dilemmas, but in naming a genuine insight. Understanding and transformation are entangled in ways that purely contemplative philosophy cannot capture. You discover what a system truly is by attempting to change it. Resistance reveals structure. The attempt to abolish capitalism teaches you what capitalism actually depends on, which features are essential and which are contingent. This remains true even if you conclude Marx was wrong about capitalism containing internal contradictions that make its transcendence inevitable. The methodology of praxis, understanding through transformative engagement, survives the specific predictions Marx built upon it. Social movements today, from labor organizing to climate activism, rediscover this insight. You learn what power is by confronting it. You understand ideology by challenging it. You grasp structure by testing its limits. With the concept of praxis, dialectical materialism became more than philosophy. It became a revolutionary program. But implementing this program revealed tensions between the theory's claims and historical reality. Karl Marx believed the revolutionary transformation he described would arrive first in England. This was not wishful thinking or ideological convenience. It followed directly from the logic of dialectical materialism itself. England possessed the most advanced industrial economy in the world, the largest and most concentrated proletariat, the starkest contradiction between socialized production and private appropriation. If capitalism's internal contradictions would force revolutionary resolution, they should reach breaking point where capitalism had developed furthest. Germany would likely follow, then France. The sequence seemed as predictable as the progression of a chemical reaction under laboratory conditions. By the time Friedrich Engels died in 1895, this prediction had not materialized. England had instead developed trade unions, factory regulations, expanded suffrage. The proletariat there was fighting for incremental reforms, not revolutionary transformation. Germany was following a similar path. The revolutionary moment that Marx and Engels had confidently anticipated kept failing to arrive precisely where their theory said it must. 22 years later, revolution did come, but it erupted in Russia, a nation where industrial capitalism remained embryonic, where the vast majority still worked the land under semi-feudal conditions, where the proletariat Marx described as history's revolutionary subject barely existed outside a few cities. Vladimir Lenin had to perform elaborate theoretical gymnastics to explain how revolution could succeed in such conditions, introducing concepts like the revolutionary vanguard and the alliance between workers and peasants that Marx himself had never emphasized. The theory had predicted revolution would emerge from capitalism's highest development. History delivered it from capitalism's periphery instead. The pattern repeated. Revolution came to China, an overwhelmingly agrarian society, to Cuba, where sugar plantations and tourist resorts dominated the economy, to Vietnam, where peasants vastly outnumbered factory workers. Meanwhile, in the advanced capitalist societies where dialectical materialism had predicted revolution as nearly inevitable, the working class developed something Marx had not seriously anticipated: a stake in the existing system's continuation. This was not a minor predictive failure. It struck at the heart of the base and superstructure model. If economic conditions determined consciousness, why did workers in the most advanced capitalist economies develop reformist consciousness rather than revolutionary consciousness? Why did they fight for higher wages within capitalism rather than capitalism's abolition? The material conditions seemed right. The contradictions were visible, yet the predicted consciousness failed to emerge. You could argue, as some Marxists did, that imperialism explained the divergence. Advanced capitalist nations exported their most brutal exploitation to colonies, using colonial profits to buy domestic working-class loyalty through higher wages and social reforms. The metropolitan proletariat became complicit in imperialism, developing what Lenin called a labor aristocracy, whose material interests aligned with colonialism's continuation. This explanation had merit, but it required adding elements to the theory that Marx himself had not foregrounded. The base was determining consciousness, but not in the way the theory had predicted. Antonio Gramsci, writing from a fascist prison cell in the 1920s and 30s, proposed a more fundamental revision. He introduced the concept of cultural hegemony, arguing that ruling classes maintain power not primarily through economic control or state violence, but through shaping the entire cultural field within which people think and imagine. The superstructure, in Gramsci's analysis, possessed far more autonomy and causal power than classical dialectical materialism allowed. Ideas could not be reduced to simple reflections of economic base. They had their own weight, their own logic, their own effects. Revolutionary transformation required not just changing economic conditions, but winning what Gramsci called a war of position in civil society, changing how people understood their world before you could change the world itself. This was dialectical materialism, but with the dial turned sharply away from economic determinism. Gramsci remained a Marxist, but he was acknowledging that consciousness did not automatically flow from material conditions in any straightforward way. The relationship was more complex, more mediated, more contingent than Marx had suggested. The Frankfurt School, emerging from Germany in the 1920s and continuing in American exile during the Nazi era, pushed the revision further. Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, asked why the German working class had failed to resist fascism, why indeed many workers had embraced it. Their answers centered on what they called instrumental reason, the form of thinking that reduces everything to means and ends, efficiency and utility. Capitalism, they argued, did not just exploit workers economically, it colonized consciousness itself, training people to think in ways that made resistance nearly impossible to imagine. The culture industry, mass media, and bureaucratic rationality all functioned to integrate individuals into the existing system at a level deeper than ideology. This was no longer Marx's dialectical materialism, it was critical theory, still materialist in grounding consciousness in social conditions, but far more pessimistic about revolutionary potential and far more attentive to culture's autonomous power. Dependency theorists, working primarily in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, offered another revision. They argued that underdevelopment in the periphery was not a stage that would naturally progress toward development as orthodox Marxism suggested. Rather, underdevelopment and development were two sides of the same process. The global capitalist system required both advanced industrial centers and underdeveloped peripheries. Revolution in peripheral nations was possible precisely because these societies had not fully developed capitalist relations of production. Their very position in the global system made them weak links where revolution could break through. This inverted Marx's prediction entirely while claiming to remain faithful to his method. Each revision attempted to rescue dialectical materialism from its predictive failures by adding complexity, acknowledging factors Marx had underweighted, granting more autonomy to the superstructure. But these revisions raised a troubling question. At what point does a theory that must be continuously revised to fit historical reality cease to be a scientific explanation and become instead a flexible interpretive framework that can accommodate any outcome? This is the falsifiability problem that haunts dialectical materialism. Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, argued that a genuinely scientific theory must be falsifiable. It must make predictions that could in principle be proven wrong by evidence. If revolution in advanced capitalist societies would falsify dialectical materialism, then the theory's failure to predict where revolutions actually occurred should count as falsification. But Marxists responded by revising the theory, explaining why revolution could occur in agrarian societies after all, why advanced capitalism could avoid revolution through imperialism or cultural hegemony or welfare state reforms. The theory became, in Popper's terminology, unfalsifiable. Whatever happened, dialectical materialism could explain it after the fact. This does not necessarily mean the theory is worthless. Psychoanalysis and evolutionary biology face similar falsifiability challenges, yet both offer valuable insights. But it does mean we cannot treat dialectical materialism as Marx sometimes suggested we should, as a science of history comparable to physics, as the discovery of iron laws governing human society. It is better understood as a powerful lens that illuminates certain dynamics, a framework that asks productive questions, a method that reveals patterns others miss, but it is not a predictive science. History is too complex, too contingent, too dependent on human choice and accident for that kind of certainty. The gap between prediction and reality reveals something essential about dialectical materialism's limits. Material conditions matter enormously. Economic relations shape possibilities and constrain choices. Class interests influence consciousness. But the relationship between base and superstructure is not mechanical determinism. Culture has weight. Ideas have consequences. Individuals and movements can shift trajectories in ways pure economic analysis cannot predict. History is dialectical, perhaps, full of contradictions that drive change, but it is not as material as Marx believed, not as predictable as his confidence sometimes suggested. These challenges forced dialectical materialism to evolve, or splinter. In the Soviet Union, it became state orthodoxy with disturbing consequences. In the West, critical Marxists attempted to salvage its insights while acknowledging its limitations. On September 18, 1938, the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union published an essay titled Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Its author, listed simply as Joseph Stalin, presented dialectical materialism not as a framework for critical inquiry, but as a complete system of scientific laws governing nature, society, and thought. The essay would be reprinted in millions of copies, translated into dozens of languages, and made mandatory reading in schools, universities, and party cells across the Soviet sphere of influence. What Marx and Engels had developed as a method for understanding capitalism's contradictions had become Diamet, a catechism with correct answers, enforced interpretations, and consequences for deviation. The transformation had been gradual but inexorable. After the 1917 revolution, Soviet intellectuals faced a peculiar challenge: how to systematize a philosophy that prized dialectical motion into textbooks suitable for mass education. Early Soviet philosophers like Abram Debrin attempted to preserve dialectical materialism's subtlety, emphasizing its continuity with Hegelian complexity and its openness to revision. But subtlety serves poorly when building a revolutionary state that demands ideological certainty. By the late 1920s, party authorities had begun to view philosophical debate itself as a form of dangerous pluralism. Stalin's essay marked the decisive victory of orthodoxy over inquiry. The essay reduced dialectical materialism to four fundamental features: the world as matter in motion, nature as connected and interdependent, development through gradual change leading to revolutionary leaps, and internal contradiction as the source of development. These principles appeared unobjectionable, even elegant in their simplicity. The danger lay not in what they said, but in what they forbade. Each feature became a measuring rod against which all scientific, artistic, and philosophical work would be judged. Work that aligned with these features was materialist, progressive, socialist. Work that deviated was idealist, reactionary, bourgeois, terms that in Stalin's Soviet Union carried consequences far beyond academic disagreement. Historical materialism received similar codification. 5 stages of social development: primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, each stage necessarily following the previous, each transition driven by contradictions between forces of production and relations of production. The schema possessed an appealing clarity. It also reduced the messy complexity of actual human history to a predetermined sequence. China, India, Africa, societies with their own distinct trajectories, had to be forced into European categories. The violence of this conceptual forcing would later find parallels in political practice. The institutionalization created an absurd situation that dialectical materialism's own principles should have predicted. A philosophy that insisted consciousness reflects material conditions became compulsory regardless of conditions. Students who found Diamet unconvincing could not say so. Intellectuals who noticed contradictions between theory and Soviet reality could not publish their observations. The state that claimed to have abolished false consciousness enforced a particular consciousness through institutional power. The revolution that promised to end ideology created an ideological apparatus more comprehensive than any previous regime. A philosophy born from critique had made itself immune to critique. Nowhere did this immunity produce stranger consequences than in the extension of dialectical materialism to natural sciences. If dialectics governed all reality, then biology, physics, chemistry, and geology must reflect dialectical principles. Soviet scientists found themselves required not merely to discover facts, but to discover the correct kind of facts. Facts demonstrating contradiction, transformation, and revolutionary leaps in nature itself. The disasters began in agriculture. Trofim Lysenko, a poorly trained agronomist, claimed to have developed a dialectical approach to plant breeding that rejected Mendelian genetics as bourgeois and idealist. According to Lysenko, organisms transformed themselves through interaction with their environment in ways that could be inherited, a revival of Lamarckism dressed in dialectical language. Characteristics acquired during an organism's lifetime would pass to offspring, demonstrating the dialectical unity of organism and environment, the transformation of quantity into quality. The claims aligned perfectly with Diamet's insistence that nature operated through revolutionary leaps rather than gradual accumulation. That Lysenko's experiments failed to produce their promised results mattered less than their ideological correctness. Scientists who defended Mendelian genetics found themselves accused of serving capitalist interests. The greatest Soviet geneticist, Nikolai Vavilov, was arrested in 1940 and died in prison 3 years later. His crime insisting that inheritance followed patterns Mendel had described rather than patterns Stalin preferred. Soviet biology would remain crippled for decades. Agricultural yields suffered, and famines that killed millions were worsened by adherence to dialectical principles in crop management. Physics faced similar pressures. Einstein's relativity theory troubled Soviet philosophers because it appeared to make physical reality dependent on the observer's reference frame, uncomfortably reminiscent of idealism's claim that mind shapes reality. Quantum mechanics, with its probabilistic interpretations and uncertainty principles, seemed even worse. How could matter be truly material if its properties remained indeterminate until observation? Soviet physicists found themselves navigating impossible requirements, produce results that matched Western science's technological achievements, while interpreting those results through Diamat's philosophical constraints. Some scientists became adept at a peculiar form of intellectual camouflage. They would preface technical papers with pro forma declarations about dialectical materialism, cite Stalin's essay and introductions, then proceed with actual physics that quietly ignored the philosophical frame. Others genuinely attempted to develop dialectical interpretations of quantum mechanics or relativity, producing work that satisfied ideological requirements while remaining scientifically sterile. The most honest simply left fields where Diamat interference proved overwhelming, moving into pure mathematics or applied engineering, where philosophical supervision operated less intensely. The paradox ran deeper than hypocrisy or political expediency. Dialectical materialism had always claimed that consciousness reflects material practice, that ideas emerge from engagement with actual conditions. Yet here was a state apparatus decreeing correct ideas in advance of investigation, demanding that nature conform to philosophical principles established before looking at nature. Scientists were told what they would find before conducting experiments. The method Marx and Engels developed to critique ideology had become ideology in its purest form, a system of thought insulated from reality by institutional power. The ossification created a strange mirror world where familiar words meant unfamiliar things. Dialectical no longer signified openness to contradiction and transformation, but adherence to specific patterns. Materialist no longer meant grounding understanding in actual conditions, but accepting the party's declarations about what those conditions were. Scientific became a term of political approval rather than methodological description. Language itself underwent transformation, but not the kind dialectical materialism described. Words did not change meaning through internal contradiction, but through external enforcement. Western observers sometimes concluded that Soviet Diamat represented dialectical materialism's true nature, that the gulags and censorship revealed what the philosophy had been all along. But this judgment fails to grasp the deeper irony. Stalinist orthodoxy did not fulfill dialectical materialism's logic. It violated that logic while claiming to embody it. A philosophy insisting that new conditions generate new forms of consciousness was used to prevent new consciousness from emerging, a method meant to analyze how economic base shapes ideological superstructure became pure superstructure, imposed regardless of base. The doctrine that promised to reveal how power sustains itself through mystification became mystification sustaining power. The transformation illuminated something genuine about what happens when critical philosophy encounters state power. Every framework for understanding the world contains resources for its own defense, ways of explaining away contradictory evidence or dismissing challenges. When those defensive resources become backed by institutional authority, criticism becomes nearly impossible. Not because the framework is logically invulnerable, Diamat contained obvious tensions and predictive failures, but because the institutional apparatus converts philosophical disagreement into political crime. The Gulag does what logical argument cannot. It ends the conversation. Yet even as Soviet Diamat ossified into dogma, Western Marxists were reimagining dialectical materialism's possibilities, asking whether its core insights might be separated from its deterministic excesses and totalitarian applications. By the early 1990s, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and Francis Fukuyama was proclaiming the end of history. Dialectical materialism, for decades the official philosophy of nearly half the world's population, seemed to have passed its expiration date. History had rendered its verdict, or so it appeared. Yet something curious happened in the decades that followed. Even as Marxist states collapsed or transformed into market economies, the questions dialectical materialism had posed refused to vanish. They migrated, mutated, and reappeared in unexpected places. The framework that claimed to explain history found itself subject to history's judgment, and that judgment proved more complicated than either its defenders or critics anticipated. What survived the wreckage was not dialectical materialism as a complete system, but something more modest and more durable, a set of insights about how material conditions shape human consciousness and social possibility. Long after revolution ceased to seem imminent, sociologists still asked how economic structures constrain individual choice. Historians still examined how modes of production influenced cultural forms. Anthropologists still explored how material circumstances shape belief systems. The base and superstructure metaphor had proven too rigid, too reductive, but the basic intuition that you cannot understand ideas without understanding the material conditions that produced them had become nearly impossible to dismiss entirely. Consider how thoroughly this materialist perspective penetrated fields that never identified as Marxist. The sociology of knowledge, as developed by Karl Mannheim and later Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann, examined how social location determines what counts as knowledge. They stripped away the revolutionary rhetoric, but the core insight remained. Consciousness reflects position within social structures. Critical theorists from the Frankfurt School onward explored how capitalism shapes not just economic relations but psychological structures, aesthetic sensibilities, even the capacity for critical thought itself. Theodor Adorno analyzing the culture industry, Herbert Marcuse describing one-dimensional man, Jürgen Habermas examining systematic distortions in communication, all pursued questions dialectical materialism had opened, even as they rejected its deterministic conclusions. Post-colonial theory drew heavily on materialist analysis while transforming it. Edward Said's concept of Orientalism showed how imperial economic domination generated elaborate cultural superstructures that naturalized exploitation. Frantz Fanon examined how colonialism operated not just through military force but through internalized psychological structures. These thinkers recognized what Marx had glimpsed. Power sustains itself, not primarily through violence, but through shaping how dominated groups understand reality. They expanded the analysis beyond class to encompass race, culture, and colonial difference, but the methodological inheritance was unmistakable. Even conservative thought engaged dialectical materialism's core claims, if only through opposition. When figures on the political right insist that ideas have consequences, that culture shapes politics more than economics does, they are responding to the materialist challenge. The very intensity of their rejection testifies to how deeply Marx and Engels shifted the terms of debate. Before dialectical materialism, few bothered to argue against economic determinism because few took it seriously as a position. After Marx, ignoring the relationship between material conditions and consciousness became intellectually untenable, regardless of where you stood politically. Yet, the framework's contributions came bundled with profound limitations that became impossible to ignore. The reduction of complex causation to economic base produced analyses that felt simultaneously insightful and incomplete. Yes, studying property relations illuminates how societies function, but can you really explain the Protestant Reformation, the rise of nationalism, or the appeal of fascism primarily through economic structures? The more historians examine specific cases, the more the neat base superstructure model seemed to flatten the texture of human experience. Culture proved far more autonomous than dialectical materialism anticipated. Ideas displayed a persistence and power that could not be explained as mere reflections of economic conditions. Why did religious fervor intensify in some societies as they modernized? Why did nationalist identities grow stronger even as economic integration increased? Why did workers in advanced capitalist societies develop welfare state consciousness rather than revolutionary consciousness? Each question suggested that culture, ideology, and identity operated according to logics that could not be reduced to material conditions, even if they could not be entirely separated from them either. The determinism problem never achieved satisfactory resolution. If economic base determines superstructure, if material conditions shape consciousness, then human agency becomes difficult to locate. The concept of praxis claimed to bridge this gap by making humans both products and producers of their conditions, but the formulation often felt more like verbal gymnastics than genuine solution. In practice, Marxist movements oscillated between two extremes, either waiting passively for contradictions to ripen into revolution, or imposing revolutionary consciousness from above through vanguard parties. Neither approach fully honored the dialectical materialism's theoretical commitment to human creativity within material constraints. Contingency repeatedly disrupted the framework's predictive capacity. Dialectical materialism claimed to reveal laws of historical development, yet history kept surprising it. The 20th century's major revolutions occurred in peasant societies rather than industrial ones. Fascism arose in advanced capitalist nations rather than collapsing from their internal contradictions. The welfare state absorbed working-class militancy rather than intensifying it. Communist parties in power often became obstacles to social progress rather than vehicles for it. Each deviation from prediction prompted theoretical revision, but the accumulation of revisions eventually raised a question. At what point does a scientific theory become an interpretive framework that can explain any outcome after the fact but predict none before? The question of whether dialectical materialism discovered historical laws or constructed a powerful interpretive lens remains genuinely contested. Those who see it as scientific discovery point to its successful predictions. Capitalism did generate cyclical crises. Class conflict did intensify during industrialization. Colonial systems did eventually collapse under their own contradictions. Those who see it as one lens among many point to its failures: the persistence of capitalism despite repeated crises, the emergence of cross-class nationalisms stronger than international worker solidarity, the transformation of communist parties into new ruling classes that reproduced exploitation under different ideological justifications. Perhaps the most honest assessment acknowledges both dimensions. Dialectical materialism illuminated real patterns in how societies change. It revealed genuine mechanisms through which economic structures constrain political possibility and shape cultural production. It provided conceptual tools for understanding structural oppression that remain valuable even for those who reject its deterministic conclusions. At the same time, it oversimplified causation, underestimated human agency, and imposed a narrative of progressive development onto historical processes that proved far messier and more contingent than the theory anticipated. Contemporary debates continue to revolve around questions dialectical materialism framed, even when participants reject its answers. When scholars argue about whether class or identity constitutes the primary axis of political conflict, they are engaging the base superstructure question in new vocabulary. When activists debate whether capitalism contains internal contradictions that will eventually force its transcendence, or whether it can indefinitely adapt and absorb opposition, they are wrestling with dialectical materialism's core predictions. When researchers examine how changes in consciousness relate to changes in material conditions, whether they are studying social movements or cultural shifts, they are pursuing questions Marx and Engels posed, even if they pursue them with very different methodological assumptions. The framework's fate teaches something important about the relationship between ideas and history. Dialectical materialism thrived during an era of rapid industrialization, clear class formations, and revolutionary upheaval. It declined as capitalism evolved in ways the theory had not anticipated, as new forms of identity and conflict emerged that could not be reduced to economic relations, and as the revolutionary moment it had announced failed to arrive in the places and ways predicted. Ideas that claimed to transcend historical conditions proved themselves bound by those conditions after all. Yet the questions it posed and the patterns it identified retain enough validity that they continue to shape intellectual life, even among those who would never identify as Marxists. What survives is neither a complete system nor a discredited relic, but something between a set of conceptual tools for analyzing how material conditions shape consciousness and social possibility, tools that must be deployed with awareness of their limitations and supplemented by attention to culture, contingency, and human agency. The recognition that you cannot understand ideas without examining the material conditions that produce them remains foundational. The belief that such examination provides a complete explanation has become untenable. Between these poles lies the space where contemporary social thought operates, whether it acknowledges the inheritance or not. In the end, dialectical materialism's fate exemplifies its own principle. Ideas reflect material conditions. Born from industrial capitalism's emergence, it thrived amid 20th century revolutionary upheaval, then fractured as that historical moment passed. What remains is not a finished system, but an ongoing conversation about matter, consciousness, and how the world changes, a conversation whose contradictions remain unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable.